Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 253. And this time I'm going to talk about the Bill Evans Trio's wonderful album from 1960 on Riverside, Portrait and Jazz. So this, of course, is the first record released by the now legendary trio formed by Bill Evans when he joined forces with Paul Motian, whom he'd been playing with for some time before, and the young and sadly short-lived bassist Scott LaFaro. This is the first of two studio releases for the trio, and of course they'd go on to hit the heights a year later with some live releases from a set of recordings made at the Village Vanguard Club in Greenwich Village. They haven't yet achieved that state of grace that they'd get to by the time of the Village Vanguard sessions, where it seems to the listener like it's just one organism playing this seamless music. But there are some suggestions here that's where they're going. Bill Evans was born in August 1929 in North Plainfield, New Jersey, which is where he grew up. His dad ran a golf course. He was also a heavy drinker, and he would get abusive and occasionally terrorize his family. His mom would occasionally take him and his older brother Harry, whom Bill idolized, off to stay with relatives, basically to get out of the heat. Harry starts to take lessons first when he's about 5 or 6 years of age, and Bill, listening in, thought to be too young to take piano lessons, quickly begins to play the lessons that Harry's been given from memory once the piano was free. He progresses rapidly in his own lessons. He's able to sight read quite easily by the time he's 9 years old. In his early teens, he then gets into jazz, particularly the piano-based jazz of people like Earl Hines and especially Nat King Cole. As his teen years progressed, he began to gig regularly, sometimes playing 3 or 4 times a night, usually in and around New Jersey, but sometimes taking the train into the city. He graduates from high school in 1946, and he goes to Southeastern Louisiana University to study music, oddly enough on a flute scholarship. He graduates in 1950 with a degree in music. He had met the guitarist Mundell Lowe while at school, and they form a group with Red Mitchell, the bass player. That doesn't really go anywhere. There's a bunch of other efforts. Eventually, all that comes to a halt because in 1951, he gets his draft notice. Bill Evans spends 3 years in the Army, and by all accounts, it was a pretty horrible experience. He was in an Army band. He didn't see any serious active service, but his playing was mocked and ridiculed, his playing style, his approach to music, and he ends up leaving the Army 3 years later in 1954, feeling pretty bad about himself and pretty bad about his capacity as a musician. So he then goes home to his parents' house once he's demobilized in 1954 and basically turtles for a year. In early 1955, he decides to get his act together and move to New York, and he promises himself he's going to give it until his 30th birthday, which would be in 1959, before deciding whether or not this had been a success or a failure. Early in 1955, he's auditioning for the band led by Jerry Wald, the clarinetist, and another person who's auditioning at the same time is a drummer from Rhode Island, a guy called Paul Motian. Both of them get the gig, and that's where that long-lasting connection begins. His regular accomplices at this time include Paul Motian, clarinetist Tony Scott, and his old friend from university, the guitarist Mundell Lowe. Scott, Lowe, and Evans make a demo tape one evening, and Lowe plays it for Orrin Keepnews, the owner of Riverside Records, over the telephone. Keepnews is impressed. He starts to take in Bill's performances in and around Greenwich Village, and eventually he signs him to a record deal. The first product of that record deal is New Jazz Conceptions, which also has Paul Motian on drums and the bassist Teddy Kotick. It sells a grand total of 800 copies in its first year, so not much commercial impact, but the critical notices were great. Miles Davis takes an interest. Now, this is also timely because Miles, of course, has had a wonderful quintet going, but he's got itchy feet. He's been experimenting with Gil Evans and some larger group compositions, and he's also thinking, although he hasn't gotten there yet, about modal jazz, and something about the spareness and emotionality of Evans' playing really attracted him. At the same time, Red Garland, Miles's piano player, was having, let's just say, refueling issues, not showing up for gigs. So Miles phones up Bill and says, look, join us on the road. Well, this is a big break. It's a challenge, though, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Bill had never really toured, so there were a lot of pressures around that. And secondly, he was a white musician replacing a black musician in a previously all-black band, and the reaction of a lot of people in the audience was not that great. Eventually, Bill begins to manage his anxiety with the use of heroin, and that leads to an all-too-predictable spiral. And by late '58, he felt he just needed to get back to New York, get off this roller coaster, and get back to doing his own thing, which is what he does. And he goes into the studio in December 1958 to make the album, which is then titled Everybody Digs Bill Evans, which is kind of a funny title for a record made by a guy with anxiety issues, because the front cover, which I'm showing you here, is very much like a therapy session or an intervention on behalf of all his friends. This is very well received, and it wasn't the only good thing that was going to happen around this time, because Miles as I mentioned, was still fumbling his way towards modal jazz. He'd been highly influenced by Bill's thinking about composition. And in early 1959, he phones up Bill and says, "Look, I know you're not with the group anymore, but would you come and make a record?" And of course, that record turns out to be Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album in history, just in time for Bill Evans' 30th birthday. In mid-1959, Evans makes the connection, which is probably the most profound musical connection he made in his career, and there were several quite profound connections, and that, of course, is with the young bass player Scott LaFaro. LaFaro was from New Jersey, but he spent the previous 4 or 5 years out in LA. In 1959, he decides to come back to the East Coast. One night, Evans and Motian have a gig at Basin Street. LaFaro attends that, comes up and asks Bill if he can sit in. Bill says yes. It's electric, and basically that was it. Their trajectory was set. Evans's concept for the group, which was readily agreed to by LaFaro and Motian, was to have much greater organic interplay between the musicians such that it was really one performance rather than a solo on top of a bunch of accompaniment. This record is made December 28, 1959 at Reeves Recording Studios in New York City with Orrin Keepnews, predictably, as this is a Riverside record, as the producer. The trio, of course, is Evans on piano, Motian on drums, and LaFaro on bass. The recording location itself, Reeves, was not too surprising because Keepnews had arranged a long-standing deal with Reeves Studios to be able to have almost unlimited recording time, provided that he recorded at night. And this works out really well when you're recording jazz in New York in the early 1960s because almost all of the big players in the genre are playing in clubs every evening. They're done at 1 or 2 in the morning. They would just take a cab over to the recording studio and just sit down and cut the tracks they've been playing just an hour or so before. Side 1 starts with Come Rain or Come Shine, the Johnny Mercer standard. It's a very good performance, particularly by Evans, whose playing is very fluid here, at least initially. The whole track builds in tension and then it ends in a series of dramatic fills. Autumn Leaves is next, and this is maybe the highlight of the whole record. It's a very upbeat arrangement compared to the original, but the best part about this, towards the end of the track, is this incredible interplay between Evans and LaFaro. Witchcraft is next, and this is a song by the piano player Cy Coleman. If you get a chance, look on YouTube at Coleman playing this on Hugh Hefner's Playboy Club TV show, which is, well, anyway, there's no point in me describing it. Just have a look. This is a pretty faithful version. It swings pretty hard, I would say, and this is probably the swingingest track on what is probably Evans's swingingest record, but it is not very adventurous. It's followed by When I Fall in Love, which is another song that Nat Cole used to do. This is much more like it. Evans's performance here is wistful, almost distant and inward. Anyway, it's really quite striking. The final track on side 1 is Perry's Scope, an upbeat, cheerful track which was written for his girlfriend at the time, Perry. By all accounts, this really matches her personality. Side 2 starts with Cole Porter's song, What Is This Thing Called Love? Quite faithful to the original upbeat arrangement, and this is notable too because it's the first solo for Motian on the record. Then we have Rodgers and Hart's Spring Is Here, and this is quite a radical interpretation, kind of like what Glenn Gould did with Bach's Goldberg Variations when he re-recorded them. This is slowed down significantly, and the effect is really stunning, especially, again, this interplay between Evans and LaFaro towards the end. The second last track on the record is a Disney tune, Someday My Prince Will Come. Now, of course, Dave Brubeck had done this in 1957. This version, I have to say, I much prefer to Brubeck's because Evans's touch is just so much more subtle. And another good thing about this track is that LaFaro seems a bit higher in the mix than on other numbers. The final track is Blue and Green, which of course appears on Kind of Blue a year before. Evans says he wrote it. Davis says he didn't and sent Evans a check for $25. It's got this very gentle opening. Then it really swings before a very nice, thoughtful conclusion. I have to say this isn't Bill Evans' best or certainly most adventurous record. In particular, some of the standards are not particularly inspiring, but other moments are fantastic. To be clear, the very best tracks in this record are either the ballads or the non-ballads that Evans has chosen to slow down, so they're effectively ballads. This isn't just because the best qualities of Evans' playing, the emotional nature of his playing comes out here. It's also because those tracks, the tracks where there's more space, allow LaFaro's playing to come to the fore, which is the real magic of the trio, frankly. The pinnacle for these guys may be the Vanguard sessions, but this is still top-class trio work, and the seeds of that greatness to come are obvious on here. For me, this is 4 out of 5 stars.